Hello again. This is my second seminar. You've had one from Garrett on texture, which he rather helpfully called Texture 1. And just to make it really clear, I'm calling this Texture 2. We're both looking at this texture of the idea of writing for a flute, a viola, and a cello. And as you will be aware, this may have been mentioned already, that there isn't much repertoire for those three instruments on their own. So what we're trying to do is cover some pieces which maybe have three elements in them, and how those three are woven by the composer. That would be my approach in this, definitely. To give you some ideas about how you can create this sort of a texture that there isn't. As I said, it's not like a string quartet where you can go and listen to lots of string quartets. So that you'll have an idea, maybe get some ideas of how to handle the resources, just in terms of the way that material might be used, in terms of the way that the musical language can be constructed around the forces that it's written for. So I'll be looking at three pieces, and let's get going to the first one then, which is a piece by a composer that I know Garrett has been dealing with you, who's György Ligeti. And this is a horn trio. So it's horn, violin, and piano. So they're the three elements. And even though the piano is, of course, a much more multifaceted instrument than any of the three that you're writing for, the way that Ligeti deals with these in the first movement, I think, first movement in particular, is really interesting because of the separation of roles that goes through an awful lot of this music. So we'll be looking at that, listening to it, and it's a wonderful, wonderful piece. I well remember, I'm old enough to remember hearing an early broadcast of this, and it was like Ligeti, who had written pieces where the harmony was saturated, had rediscovered harmony and intervals in his music. If you know any of his earlier music, pieces like Atmosphere for orchestra, or Lontano or San Francisco Polyphony, there's such a denseness of texture that actually individual notes don't always stand out, certainly not in Atmosphere. But when you come to the horn trio here, he begins, amazingly for him, if you told him this in 1960, he probably would have laughed at you, begins with a major third, which would have been completely an antithesis to anything he was trying to do in his earlier music. But this piece leads to, I know Garrett was dealing with the piano etudes, leads to his later language where the various elements of music have been reformulated and reassessed and reused by him in a new way. So if you like, he's using harmony in a new way, melody in a new way, rhythm in a new way, even texture is in a new way. And this piece, which is for the same instrumentation as a famous trio by Johannes Brahms, wonderful piece worth listening to as well, is one of his first pieces, apart from string quartets as well, that would be into this chamber music vein, as I said, where you have three instruments, each given a very different role. We're going to look at and listen to the first movement, and the first movement is, broadly speaking, in ternary form, a simple ABA form, which we saw in relation to the Janicek piece that I did with you. An opening section, a contrasting section, and then back to the first section, put simply. And if we go to briefly, not that, sorry, wrong piece. Here we go. And we go to the beginning of it. Let's just have a listen to the opening of this piece, and then I'll come back to it and talk to it a bit more. And there's a nice smiley photograph of Ligeti first. We don't need to worry about the notation of the horn part. Here we go. That's a very short example. I'll let you hear that from the beginning again in a minute. But taking that opening, and I'm going to go to the piano now to talk about this briefly. You have, as you can see, the major third, GB, the double stop on the violin. The violin is generally playing double stops or triple stops, as you can see at the end of the first system there. Each instrument is given a different character and different material at this beginning. The violin is essentially doing these double stops, as you can see, and sometimes triple stops, as I've said. We're back to the notes now. And I'll come to the allusion to Beethoven's Les Adieux Sonata in a minute, because that's, again, back to the thing I mentioned at the end of my first session, to do with allusion to other composers. It's not a quote, but it will conjure something very distinctive up, because it's the very beginning of the Beethoven Sonata, which I'll let you hear in a second. So that's the violin line, these double, sometimes triple stops. The horn is playing these phrases with quite large intervals and quite a wide compass. The piano's not doing a lot at this point. It's essentially punctuating at the end with this cadential figure in its high register. And he takes those three elements, and they're the three elements that he builds a lot of the music on. So I'm going to go to the piano briefly now and just talk you through that allusion to Beethoven. Right, so we'll go into that. Ligeti is, and so on, but even that much sounds like very little, but here's the beginning of the Beethoven Sonata. So I think you can hear the relationship between, and then one is from a major third to a tritone. The other is a major third to a perfect fifth, which is a very tonal gesture in Beethoven's sense. But it's a very famous beginning because the words, or the word underneath it that was ascribed to these three notes was Lebewohl, which means farewell. Lebewohl. And the fact that it's not an E flat major chord and it's a deflection like that, and that it's got this valedictory farewell character is quite important. And Ligeti is, I think, he's too smart to know that, yes, you may not think that you can just use two notes and that it will sound like another composer, but I think it's too close a gesture to be not conscious on his part. So that's the relationship there. And I think you can hear that quite clearly. There are several other pieces that allude to that as well, including the first movement of Mahler's Ninth Symphony, where you get an awful lot of just that much without the whole thing. So it's almost like it's an emblematic gesture, but that's what Ligeti uses at the beginning. So we'll go back to the score now and look at it a bit closer and talk about some of the details. So we have that opening, as I've said, double and triple stops, and they're the characteristic of that more than anything else. The horn with these large intervals and quite a wide compass. In orchestral terms, normally the horn is divided into high horn parts and low horn parts, but Ligeti writes a really demanding part for one horn player, which covers the whole range of the instrument in this piece. And as I said, the piano is not doing an awful lot at this point. That changes as we go on. But if we listen on from the beginning to this opening section and see what Ligeti does with that material. So from the beginning, sorry, that's not the actual beginning. Back again. There we go. Smiley Ligeti again. You see it's written in 4/4, but I don't think we feel that at all. Here's the piano. It's a descending little figure. Now we begin with the horn, followed by the violin. Again, the piano. And he begins to change things. They begin almost together, horn and violin. Still nothing from the piano though. I could play that piano part so far. You can hear how wide-ranging the horn part is as well. So they both have a distinctive character. And every so often they're synchronized, like there. And if you think of the Beethoven and listen to the piano here, it's very clearly referring to it. And then it goes on. And that is the end of the first section of the movement. So you can hear, I think, and see relatively clearly, we'll come back to the score in a minute, the way that he's doing things. The second phrase, so bars 1 to 12 is the first unit. So you've violin followed by horn, followed by piano, just at the end. The second time you've got horn first, then violin, then piano. So a simple variation, but obviously belonging to the same type of gesture. Then between bars 22 and 39, he develops it. They start almost simultaneously, the horn and the violin, as opposed to being separate and having a clear profile, probably because you've already heard each one of them individually now, so there's no need to separate them. And the piano doesn't do anything for a while. And you can see there are gaps as well, as I've said there, rests at the end of bar 26, I think it is, and bar 33, where you might expect the piano to come in and punctuate, as it had done in the first two phrases, but it doesn't, which of course increases tension as well, and your expectation that, well, what's the piano going to do at some point? From bars 39 to 59, which we'll look at in a bit more detail, he begins to incorporate the three of them for the first time really continuously into a three-part texture, as opposed to what has been generally solos on top of one another with the little punctuation from the piano. And again, as I've said there, it begins with the Beethoven allusion, but from the violin again. The violin played the allusion at the beginning. It's the piano that does it here. But it very much refers to that. So it's taking the violin's material, that's the critical thing. And then it has its own high registral cadential idea. And then it actually echoes what the horn does, which is what the violin does a little bit as well. These runs up to higher notes. So we'll go back to the score now, and we'll check that out. Just bear with me a second while I set it up. Right. So here's the beginning. This is from bar 29, the violin and the horn have begun together. And they've been going for quite a while together. So the piano comes in here, and you can see it's that descending major second and a major third followed by a tritone. So it's using, in other words, what was the violin's motif, but simply doubling it by having the right and the left hand play it. And from there, we go to the next page. That's not quite the next page, sorry. Here, you have this flourish upwards in the horn, which is a feature. There it is there. There's the high cadential material in the piano, again, except now it's MF. But he literally likes to use the extremes of instruments, and he really makes the instruments' registers tell very powerfully. You'll see he uses the lower register of the piano a bit further on this movement, but at the moment, he's up in the top of register again. The horn again has this flourish, and it's followed by, you can see a flourish figure in the piano here in bar 44. Then it goes back up to the top register again. So it's taking these features, I'll let you hear this again before we go on to the middle bit as well, and building on them. There's the flourish again, and yeah, we can sort of see then, if we go back again to where we are, should be around about here. Yeah, that's a pretty good place to go for. Actually, I'll go back a little bit further. There we go. And you'll hear what happens when the piano comes in. I'll talk you through a bit of this, and we'll go on a little bit further into the B section, which I'll let you hear a bit of and then describe what's happening. So. So you'd expect the piano to come in with a cadential idea here, but it doesn't. Instead, it comes in with this. There's a flourish in the horn, the high cadential thing in the piano, another flourish in the horn, then the piano, more high rising for the piano, again, no. It's changed the role again. There's another reference to the opening in the flute, the violin, another flourish there, more high rising for the piano. And this is very much a punctuation, this cadential idea. So that ends the first section. Morendo, dying away. This is the contrast. And I'll just let it play until we clearly hear something from the earlier part of the movement. The piano goes down to its lower register. And actually he overlaps now with the double stops and the horn line back to the tempo primo, original tempo, but not exactly as at the opening. Piano's still down at the bottom register. But this is exactly from earlier. Here, you can really recognize, I think, what's going on. And he follows it with the horn followed by the violin there, which is what happened at the beginning of the movement as well. So he's gone back into it, but he's done it in a very subtle way. Actually, a way that, oddly enough, is not unrelated to what Brahms does in a lot of his music. So you can hear the central section is quite different. It's quite short. He could have made quite an extended section out of it, but he chooses not to. So what you're getting here is, I've said about that development and the further development. In B, in that central section, he pairs the instruments. Even though there's 3, he makes it 2 plus 2. Just for another variety in texture. So that's the textural approach there. So in bars 60 to 62, it's the piano with pizzicato violin. Then in 64 to 66, the violin plays harmonics. So if you like, it becomes a different instrument, a different colour, and the horn plays with it. And that's repeated. And then the violin plays tremolo with the piano before the piano moves down to that lower register that I mentioned, and he overlaps that with a beginning, a return to the opening material. And as I've said there, he begins in 84 at tempo primo, but not the same as at the beginning, because the horn and violin begin together. He's actually sort of going backwards through it, because the three of them are playing together. Piano remains in that lower register, and then the high cadential idea returns. And that's the most recognizable return of material from earlier in the movement. So if we look at that, I think we can see it very, very clearly in the score as well. Let's go back a tiny bit. There we go. And this, you should be able to hear this again. So this is the dying out of the first section. Here we go. Pizzicato and piano. One colour, then horn and harmonics on the violin. Another pairing. Back to the first one. Then back to the second one. And then he develops that with sul pont tremolo on the violin. Still with the piano though. The piano keeps going. So for the whole of this, the three instruments have not played together in this middle section, which is quite interesting. Piano keeps going down. The others are playing references back to the first section, so we're back in at that point. Particularly that semitone in the violin, I think we really remember it from earlier. And there's the cadential figure on the piano. So at that point we're back, and he basically follows that through for the rest of the movement. You can go and listen to it yourselves, we don't have to deal with it. But I think you can hear how he's using those textures as a really important structural element. It also gives, it's worth, I'm sure we will have mentioned this, and we will, that you don't have to have all three instruments playing all the time. Ligeti does a wonderful job of that there, that not all three of them are going full pell-mell all the time. They do in one or two of the other movements, but not in this movement where you have that sparsity of texture. So that's Ligeti and his piano trio. Do listen to the whole piece. I think it's a masterpiece. And we're going to move on to our second composer. Our second composer is Laura Elise Schwendinger, an American composer who actually was a guest composer at the summer school a few years ago now. I think it was 2016, but I may be open to correction. And we've maintained contact since, and we're going to have a look at a piece of hers which actually comes reasonably close to the trio you're writing for, which is a piece called Rumour. Note the Americanized spelling. It should be, of course, R-U-M-O-U-R, for flute and cello, which she wrote in 2004. Again, the formal layout, oddly enough, is pretty much similar. More or less an ABA. There is a clear reference back to the opening, but not a literal return. It doesn't go back to the beginning and go through it again. But it's more like a textual, as I've said, than a literal restatement. Now, what I'm going to do is briefly talk about some of the ideas behind this piece, and then we can listen to the whole thing. I think it's worth hearing this and following it in the score, because I'm pretty sure it will be a piece you don't know. And I'll talk through some of the things that are happening as we go through the piece. So it's not that long, but it's worth hearing the full extent of how she controls the language, and particularly the sparseness of texture with just two instruments. So the idea behind it, well, when you call a piece rumour, how do rumours start? Somebody hears something, somebody may hear it wrong, or they repeat something that they've heard and change it a bit. And this approach to the material is something that Laura uses throughout. Not all the way, not consistently every bit of the time, but we'll see some instances where I think it's quite clear what's going on. So the idea is of a dialogue. The instruments, like in the Ligeti, they have different material, but sometimes they take up ideas from one another. There's a really clear instance of this at the opening of the piece. And I'm just going to go to that now. We can have a look at it in the score. And you can see the cello begins on its own. There's a high D sharp there. Then there's actually the same D sharp but played as an artificial harmonic. It repeats that and does it a couple of times. And then it repeats that high D sharp again. And that's actually the first note that the flute plays. So literally the cello gives the flute its first entry. And then the flute comes in with its own material. So there's a clear instance at the opening of what I was talking about in terms of dialogue. There's also a dialogue created in a slightly different way, which is by having the instruments pass the ideas to each other, as we've seen at the opening. Or in that case, it's really just pitch, but still, pitch is an idea. But also that the instrumental line, sometimes each individual line will turn back on itself. And it's as if you're saying something, somebody says something else, but you go back to the point you were originally making in a dialogue. I said, I want to go and have a cup of tea. Do you want to go out? No, I want to have a cup of tea. There's a perfect example of it. So it almost can be thought of in that way. It's not maybe that literal. I'm not even sure if Laura would, it'd probably be a cup of coffee for her rather than a tea anyway. But we'll see this happens with the flute part, which I'll come back to now. We go back to the score. Bear with me. Here we go. You can see the flute comes in with this figure D sharp, G, C sharp, A. Then there's a gap, a rest, and she uses silence, which is a really good point, very, very tellingly in this piece. But then the next phrase of the flute begins with that same C sharp, A, but goes in a different direction. Actually, it sort of goes a bit backwards through it. It goes back to the D sharp, but not the G. It goes back to an A instead. So there's that relationship of picking up something very audible, a thread from the previous ideas, because it's quite a fluid approach, as I said, essentially a dialogue or a conversation. So that's a central element in the piece, is that idea of dialogue. And if you like, yours could be a 3-part conversation handled in a different way or a similar way with your instruments. The other idea that's really important in it is the exploration of instrumental colours and ranges. Good idea when you're writing for these instruments, but she does it really, really well in this piece. And separating the material out according to register, according to texture. And she actually changes from flute to piccolo and back to flute again in the piece as well. And that adds an extra layer of texture and colour to what she's doing, because the piccolo is quite a different sound from the flute. So those colours, and I'll just talk about these generally. With the flute, she's using quite a wide register, as you'll hear. This gesture of falling away from a pitch. And I'll just bear with me while I go back briefly to the score. You see here it says roll in. You probably can't see it because it's so small, but you can see it if you look at the score. And this roll in seems to mean, I think she's a flautist herself, that it's a particular technique to achieve this falling away from the note. She also uses flutter tonguing and, as I said, introduces the piccolo as a completely different colour as well. So that's some of the elements in the flute part. And the cello part, similarly a wide register. The cello, anyway, has more or less 3, you could argue more, distinct parts of its range. The lower part, the middle, the top, then the colours of harmonics and things like that. So she uses harmonics there. She uses pizzicato, Bartók pizzicato, and glissandi as well, but doesn't use, oddly enough, doesn't use any double stops, just like Ligeti does at the very beginning for the violin in his horn trio. Laura chooses not to. It's not that it makes the part any easier to play. I don't think it does. It's just she simply chooses not to do that. I think it's maybe to keep the sense of one line against another line rather than one of them with double stops becoming more of a harmonic control or element. Note also, as we listen to this piece, which we'll do now, we'll just listen straight through to it before we go on to our final piece, the use of silence as a punctuation. I've given bar 78 as one bar, but actually it's at the very beginning as well. The one at 78 is intriguing because it seems to come out of nowhere. It literally interrupts the music. Ligeti uses silence to punctuate things as well and separate them out, as does Laura at the beginning of her piece. But later on, as I said, it's an interruption. And it also measures out the music as you're listening to it. Can be a really important element in your musical language, silence. Don't have to use it. You use it too much, it breaks the piece up. You use it a bit, it gives it that element of punctuation. So if you like, you can almost take a breath and go, right, we're at that point in the score. More than that, I don't think there's too much needs to be said. So what I'll do is I'll scroll through the score, let you hear it, and maybe highlight some issues as we're going through with it as well. So the score should be clearly followable there. Just give me a second to start the recording. So this is Rumour for flute and cello by Laura Schwendinger. Let's give it a second to get itself going. Here's the artificial harmonic. The colours particularly there. Flute comes in, you almost don't hear it. The C sharp and the A. There's the falling away. Into a different section now. Change to piccolo quite fast. There's the rest. Back to flute. There's the gap for the change. Bartok pits. Back to the more or less the original tempo almost now. The way it's taking its pitches and following on. And the flute will repeat its own ideas, like there. So they have their separate identities. Here's the opening, with an added element here of a glissando. And again, the flute comes back in, takes the same note. Begins to fragment now. There's the falling away again. So that's Laura's piece, which I think works really, really well. You don't feel that the two instruments are a limitation on her imagination at all. But what I hope you can hear, and you can look closer at the score yourselves, is the way that each instrument maintains its identity by the way the flute, for example, that da-da-da-da-da, takes that figure, and then in the next phrase will repeat it as well. And some stuff is exclusive to each instrument. Here and there they do respond to one another. As I said, usually it's that sharing of pitch that's the most obvious way. But there are also parallel gestures which contribute to this sense of dialogue between the instruments. So when you use a sort of an associative term like rumour for a title, it gives you a clue, I think, as to what she's trying to do musically in the piece. I think it works very, very well. And again, the way that silence punctuates things, there's some quite hectic activity going on. And you can see with the rhythmic activity as well, there's an acceleration towards the quicker motion of the middle section, and more or less, not quite a writ or slowing up, but back towards the original opening tempo, so that it's framed very well that way. So that's Laura Schwendinger, who is head of composition at Madison University of Wisconsin, and we may be able to connect with her, get her to tell us a little bit about her music, and you may be able to discuss with her in one of the Zoom sessions at some point, given the time difference between our countries. But she is delighted that she's having her piece featured, and if we can, we'll be able to arrange that. For now, we're going to stick with America and move on to my last piece of this. A piece that you may know, and I'm not sure how much I will need to consider doing this in great detail, given that it may be well known, but I think an approach to it is really an interesting one, because this is not, unlike the trio of Ligeti and the duo of Laura Schwendinger, this is written for 3 instrumental groups, as opposed to 3 instruments or 2 instruments. It's written for strings, it's written for a solo trumpet, although as we'll see in the score, he's actually very practically sort of specifying, well, if a trumpet can't do it, this instrument can do it. There's also 4 flute parts, and he also provides alternatives to them as well, including a little bit at the end where, if clarinets are being used, which they're not in the recording we'll be looking at and listening to, they can get their own element at the end. So the piece is The Unanswered Question, written by Charles Ives, the father of sort of 20th century and 21st century American music. It is pretty sobering to think that his greatest piece, the Fourth Symphony, I think we can safely say it's his greatest piece. Some might argue for the Concord Sonata as well, but the amount of time between him finishing pieces and getting to hear them is rather frightening. He finished the Fourth Symphony around about 1916 or 17. Ives is a bit of a fibber. He will change dates of composition slightly to make it appear that he's even more modern than he actually was, although he was still quite advanced in his thinking. But he finished it around about then, 1916. And then if you invert the last two numbers of the date, 1961 was when it was first performed complete. Ives died in 1954, as you can see here. So he never heard the whole symphony complete, which is rather shameful. It's a very difficult piece to play. It takes a huge amount of organisation and needs at least two conductors, if not three, for it to work. But still, the unanswered question is part of a duo of chamber orchestral pieces. The other one is called Central Park in the Dark, where he is dealing with, on the one level, natural realism, essentially, in Central Park in the Dark. But in the unanswered question, it's not really that he's depicting. It's more a mystical argument, a philosophical argument almost, if you like, that he's proposing in the music. I was talking about, when Ligeti gives the title Horn Trio, that tells you there's three instruments and one of them is a horn. It doesn't really tell you anything else about the piece. When Laura calls her piece Rumour, that gives you a predisposition as to what you might expect in terms of the musical language. With Ives, the unanswered question, well, you expect at least two things. You expect a question, and you also expect it to be unanswered. Quite what the question is, well, that's a moot point. But his textural strategy for this piece is really intriguing. Each group of instruments, I've called them, even though we'll call the trumpet a group for the moment, even though it's a solo instrument, each layer, if you like, of the texture has a completely different function in relation to the others. So it is related to what Ligeti is doing in the first movement of his horn trio, but in some ways it's even more radical. And there are these titles he gave to what the function of each of these groups was. The strings he referred to as the silence of the Druids. Well, they're not silent, but they're very quiet anyway. But the Druids are the ones being personified in that. The trumpet gets to ask the question, the perennial question of existence. And there's a deep philosophical discussion that if we were in person, we could be having over several cups of coffee and probably not solving it at all. But Ives puts it in musical terms. The four flutes he calls the fighting answers. And so again, or answerers, sorry. So you've got, they're answering, but they're also fighting. So again, the musical character is laid out in these titles. These titles may not have been there for somebody at a performance of this piece, but nevertheless, the title overall of the piece makes it very, very clear. 1908 it was written, or at least finished, we think. So the compositional ideas behind it are that each group, as I've said, plays different material with different characteristics, and they're juxtaposed to form, if you like, the trajectory of the piece. What I'll do is I'll let you hear, and we can watch from the beginning. We'll go to this recording of it. And we'll listen to a bit of it first, just in case some of you may not know it, and you'll get some sense, as well as seeing how it's notated, I think is of interest. So this is should be from the beginning. Actually, maybe just, here we go. So these are the silence of the Druids. Very slow. And basically tonal, starting with a G major chord and moving from there. Very hymn-like, I think you could say. And it's a really beautiful sound world. It immediately gets you into that spiritual frame of mind. Here comes the trumpet, or English horn, or oboe, or clarinet, according to the score. So that's the question being asked. Marked adagio now, you have the 4 flutes. And sorry to stop it, but I'll stop it for there, and we can go back or continue on from there as we wish, because I know you can listen to this piece through yourselves if you wish to. But let's go to the score. You can see the way it's layered out. What I do find amazing is that you've got so many either ors in the instrumentation. I think probably thinking that, well, hopefully this piece will get played in some way, however. To return to my notes then, so they played different material with different characteristics. You could hear that at the beginning there. The flute have nothing to do with what the trumpet has done. The trumpet has nothing to do with what the strings have done. This is a completely new approach to texture. You think of melody and harmony and how they're interwoven in all the music, pretty much all the music, going right back to the Middle Ages, up until the 20th century. There are 1 or 2 instances where things happen simultaneously that are not related to one another. Some adventure in that area, but Ives really takes this one by the scruff of the neck. His father apparently was a bandmaster and liked the idea of, in a town square, having 4 different bands all approaching the town square, all playing different music simultaneously. So if that didn't breed into what Ives was going to do musically, I'm not sure what did. Apparently he used to get them to sing in quarter tones as well, which I'm sure would have him up before a court of arbitration nowadays. This is Ives' father. But anyway, Ives himself was very adventurous musically, and what he's doing in this piece is this layering, this philosophical trajectory we'll see as we go through the piece, because it's quite static to begin with. And that contrast between material that's changing and material that's not changing is one of the most intriguing things of the piece as well. So the strings are playing tonal material, as I said, it's hymn-like, and largo molto semple. The trumpet comes in, plays a 5-note figure, ba, 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 ba. Badly sung, but you get the point, in triplets. And the fact that it's in triplets all the time means it suggests a slightly different speed to what the strings are playing. Then the 4 flutes come in and play completely non-tonal material, again like the trumpet thing, which is non-tonal, but in changing tempi and dynamics as they play. They start off adagio and P, and we'll deal with how they progress through it as we look at the score. But the 3 layers are different in terms of the notes used, or the harmonies that they imply or state, the instrumental colour, of course, because they're completely distinct, dynamics also, particularly later on in the piece, and tempo. And there's no attempt at any stage to unify them and make them blend together. The string chords keep moving at that very slow pace. The Druids, their silence is not broken. And what that suggests is continuity. It's a continuous texture from the beginning to the end of the piece. He does this in Central Park in the Dark as well, by the way, where you have a string sequence of chords. Again, in this case, in the case of Central Park in the Dark, they're non-tonal. And they are repeated even as the hubbub above it gets louder and louder and louder. It's a piece well worth listening to. And then you hear them when the din, which it climaxes in, breaks off, as if they've just been going on all the way throughout, which they effectively have. So they suggest continuity in both cases. But here it's a tonal language. The trumpet plays at the same tempo, dynamic, pitch, and more or less the same rhythm each time it plays its 5-note figure as well, because it's a question, and the same question is being asked all the time. So what it suggests is stasis rather than movement, not even slow movement, just stasis, not going anywhere. The flutes, on the other hand, initially are marked adagio in triplets, but they get quicker and louder each time we hear them, and they suggest, to me anyway, restlessness and anger. And these things are happening in sequence as we listen to the piece. So we can go back to the piece and listen on. We've had the first presentation. So what I'll deal with briefly when we go through this as well is how the piece mixes this element of slow movement, non-movement, which is stasis, and then rapidly changing each time you hear it material for the flutes. So there's 3 levels that everything is operating on. So if we continue on. It's just about to come in again, the trumpet. Exactly the same as earlier. And it's indifferent to what the strings are doing. It doesn't coincide. Now they're MP, the flutes, and andante. Again, it has no effect on the strings whatsoever. The trumpet has a 1-track mind. Here it is again. The flutes are now allegretto and MF. So that's increasing the level of tension and also disparity in the texture all the time. We expect music to be one thing at a time a lot of the time. It's 3 here. Horn again. Sorry, trumpet, not horn. Saw English horn written in front of me. Exactly the same again. Now allegro marked forte. And getting more disruptive and impatient, if you want to call it that. So this is his philosophical trajectory, which is why I'm talking you through it. He's doing this very deliberately. Trumpet, we're back where we started again. The violins, strings have not changed what they're doing at all. They don't react. Flutes, allegro molto, F and FF. Then a PP chord, which is an amazing effect, down the bottom of their register. Now you see he's written in the score here, trumpet holds note here until flutes start. And now the flutes take up that idea, but molto agitando, con fuoco. Very shrill. We don't have this bit played by the oboe and clarinet because there isn't an oboe and a clarinet in this recording. But strings have not changed at all. They keep moving, but they're indifferent to what's going on. And once more, because the trumpet is not very satisfied by that answer or non-answer, although this time it's PP rather than piano. And one of the most revolutionary things about this piece is the fact that it ends with a major chord, but there is no sense of resolution at the end. Absolutely none. You're left with these disparate threads which react. I'm not sure they react to one another. Certainly the strings and the trumpet provoke the 4 flutes, which is a really interesting way to think about texture. But the trumpet doesn't change at all. It goes to PP at the end, and maybe that's a fading away, implying probably that this process is continuing to search for an answer at the end. So that way of handling texture and the different textures of the instruments and the different roles and characters of them, you could do that for your trio if you want to. I don't know, would you do it for the whole piece? It might be an idea to do it maybe at some part that there's a conflict between them, but then to have them actually as a good contrast playing absolutely together at some point as well would work well as a contrast to that. Ives is a short, 1-track, 1 element, 1 philosophical approach piece, which doesn't basically set out to do anything more than what it does. And what it does beautifully and absolutely unmistakably. It's one of the most original pieces of the 20th century, I think. And it's absolutely clear line between what its intent is and the way that it goes about doing those things. So that means we're more or less there with this second seminar of mine as well. And again, thank you for your patience and indulgence. And I hope even if you know the unanswered question, that you've maybe got some interesting perspective on it from what I've been saying about it. And you may know the Ligeti trio as well, but I'm pretty sure you wouldn't have known Laura's piece. In terms of texture, other things that you could listen to, and these are all available with a scroll score on YouTube, so they're very handy that way. Not exactly the same instrumental texture, except for one piece, which is the last one on the list there, which is by Albert Roussel, which is a trio for flute, viola and cello, which he wrote in 1929. And miraculously, the score is available on YouTube to follow with it. It's a really interesting piece. And partly I didn't discuss that in more detail because it's more the colours of it that it's useful for it to hear. The musical points I wanted to make about compositions were related, of course, to the pieces I was discussing. But it is a beautifully written piece. And then there are two other pieces that I think are close enough in terms of texture. One is by Stravinsky, which is the suite he wrote for clarinet, violin and piano based on L'Histoire du Soldat, A Soldier's Tale. Yes, you've got a piano, but you can listen to that and think, well, okay, clarinet and violin have different roles to do. And of course, it's not flute and viola, but still a wind instrument and a string instrument. And then think about the piano maybe as that the cello might provide a bass line, it might not, or that the viola and cello together could do what the piano does. But they're really interesting to listen to in terms of them being trios. The other piece is a piece by Bela Bartok called Contrasts, also for clarinet, violin and piano, written in 1938, which was played by Benny Goodman, interestingly. So these are pieces that I think, in terms of just texture and hearing the three instruments or three parts sounding together, may well be very useful. And that is the end of my second seminar. We'll have a Q&A session afterwards, so I'm sure you may have some questions or things you want me to discuss more fully, and I'd be happy to do that. But for the moment, thank you very much for your attention.